And as we already saw in video 1 in our organization sheet, most of the world's currencies are actually now floating exchange rate regimes. And floating regimes are not backed by anything like gold. In fact, the current world monetary system doesn't assign any special role to gold at all. The end of the Bretton Woods system brought an end to a representative money system. And the world, as we know it today, runs what we call a fiat money system. Representative money is most commonly defined as paper or coin that has a claim on a commodity. So, for example, gold or silver. And it can also be called quite generically as a commodity-backed money. Fiat money is currency that essentially derives its value from government regulation or law. The government law basically just states that a particular currency is legal tender of that country or economic zone, and that makes all other forms of paper or coin non-legal tender. Another law is that governments and central banks control the amount of printing of the currency, therefore making it illegal for anyone else except the government to print it. And fiat money basically has no intrinsic value. It's controlled by the government and the central bank. So basically the way a fiat money system works is that society just needs to simply trust the fiat system and have faith in the government and the central bank to manage the economy. So within the economy, managing GDP growth, gross domestic product growth, inflation, so inflation of prices, employment, so jobs, and the balance of payments, so the payments for international trade. And it requires that society has faith in the legal system. So the value of a currency under a floating exchange rate regime is supposed to be determined by the free market forces of demand and supply. However, as we've just seen throughout history, as a result of war, international competitiveness, economic crises, high levels of government debt, throughout history, these situations lead to intervention and mismanagement. And you have to bear this in mind. It's very important for currency markets overall, even in the modern world. So, for example, the Federal Reserve in the US, so the US Central Bank, the ECB, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, so the BOJ, they're not obliged to tie the value of their currencies to anything. They can essentially print as much or as little money as they deem appropriate, and they're in complete control of the money supply. Now, we mentioned earlier we mentioned managed floats. And managed floats are basically floating exchange rate regimes, but with active management from government or central banks, where the authorities make gradual adjustments, and we should have really put that in quotations, make gradual adjustments in the exchange rate in order to manipulate the currency value in relation to others. So freely floating exchange rates are supposed to be left alone, but there is always some sort of management going on from central authorities if currencies that are supposed to freely float create situations in their value that are politically unacceptable. So the idea is that in a managed float, you have a floating regime, but the central authorities are allowed from time to time to intervene and manage or manipulate the value of the currency in the favor of the country that they're in. So this type of this type of intervention is effectively trying to create stabilization in the balance of trade, so in imports and exports. And if the market has no confidence or faith in a currency, liquidity essentially dries up in the currency markets, and this creates volatility. And a freely floating exchange rate can actually fluctuate quite wildly, and it creates a crisis of confidence in trade, and it can become self-fulfilling. And when a government steps in and manipulates the floating exchange rate to the disadvantage of other countries, it's termed either a managed float or a dirty float. So they're kind of breaking their own rules. They're saying we're a freely floating exchange rate, but if the exchange rate becomes too economically or politically unacceptable, we will intervene and manage the value of our currency in our favor. So we've got to get these definitions. We've got to get these definitions under wraps. A fixed regime is one in which the value of a currency is fixed or pegged to something else. So either another currency or, as in the Bretton Woods example, fixed to the value of gold. And in that situation, in the Bretton Woods situation, money can't be printed at a rate that is higher than new gold can be mined. So that stops central banks and governments controlling and printing the money supply and manipulating it in their own favor. That system broke. So it's important to understand the history so we can understand the differences. That system broke, and now all currencies pretty much are freely floating currencies. However, there is a caveat to this. Freely floating currencies frequently are managed through dirty floats, and that's the phrase we use. Freely floating exchange rates are supposed to freely float against other currencies. However, when the value of a country's currency that's supposed to float freely becomes economically or politically unacceptable in terms of competitiveness versus the rest of the world, typically what you will see, and this happens in the modern world all the time, and we're going to touch on this much later in the video series, typically what you will see is central authorities, governments, and central banks intervening in the markets to manipulate the currency in their own favor.